since probably 1990. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's a coup in Haiti, but even Latin America, that world coups are belong to some extent to the past. But that doesn't mean the cycle belongs to the past. And one of the ways that the cycle continues is that incumbent governments use incumbent power to introduce authoritarian elements into democracy, hybridizing democracy, as the term now has it, backsliding, if the term is often used. And it's my interpretation, so you are going to give yours. By my interpretation, Peru anticipated that possibility. Uh, and I think of Mr. Fujimori as having played a role. Now, in his case, one could say it was a self-coup, or the golpe, and therefore it fits into the coup tradition. But from another point of view, it's an incumbent who's using incumbent power between 90 and 2000, I guess, to transform the system. So Peru fits into both the cycle and the erosion part of the course. And you can see that. Now, again, that's my very, very external interpretation, and Alexandra will do hers, and I'm going to get out of that spot and listen to her. But thank you very much, Alexandra, for doing this, because the more I read, the more interesting this case becomes, and you're going to help us with understanding it. Let me see. Here, this. Thanks a lot, Aria, for setting this up.
Alexander.
Well,
It was a joint effort.
Yes,
with our
yes,
team.
it's very good that
it was an accuracy of
you can do that. Also because it will be recorded, right?
Yes.
Those who are not here. I could even say that, even though the collaboration with Budapest starts next week,
Yes.
that we will alert the Hungarian colleague who's working with the two of us, and we'll put this too and probably everything else from this course.
Yes, yes, yes.
So students there who are interested in this whole problem area, which in Hungary is pretty actual, will be able to listen to also this. So Alexander, please.
Okay, so the first thing I wanted
I
to
just have to
say,
make sure I can hear.
I'll speak louder.
No, give me a second. I
Okay.
can make it louder. Here.
I was just gonna say, this is the first time I do this in English, and I'm a little nervous, and when that happens, I tend to gloss over things. So if there's anything missing or that you need me to explain, just interrupt me or ask any questions that you want. I wanted to focus on the social conflict that's going on in Peru right now. It started on December 2022, and it's still ongoing. There's still protests, there's still violence from the military. And when I started to draft the outline of what I wanted to show, I started with the question of, can we consider this a cycle in democracy and authoritarianism? And actually, the answer is kind of no, because there's at no point in our history any kind of consolidation of democracy. So I wanted to show a little bit of information on that. But before that, there's this quote, I usually do this from Tocqueville, that I think really encompasses what's been going on in Latin America, which is, may not revolution be the most natural state for the Spaniards of South America? In that country, society is floundering at the bottom of an abyss from which its own efforts cannot rise. The people dwelling in this beautiful half continent seem obdurately determined to tear out each other's guts. Nothing can divert them from that objective. Exhaustion may induce momentary repose, the prelude to fresh frenzies. Contemplating their state of wretchedness, alternating with bouts of crying, I am tempted to believe that for them, despotism would be a blessing. This is actually something that's been mentioned many times over for the past few decades, where I think most Peruvians cannot actually think of a way democracy works. It's always authoritarianism that helps move the country along in one way or another. That's one of the things I'm going to show at first. But before we get into Peru, one thing I wanted to show is international context, because before the Peruvian protests began, there were also similar protests in Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, and Colombia. Of course, after that came the Brazilian protests and many other countries, but these were the main ones since 2019 until 2022. And they more or less followed the similar structure or similar strategies. So for the one in Bolivia, that was in 2019, I put the name in Spanish. I have no idea how to translate this, Revolución de las Piquitas, like revolution of the, it's something that you wear around your wrist to show allegiance to something. This one came about because Evo Morales, a left-wing government that actually brought light to the indigenous peoples and tried to insert the market with a more equalized strategy, was heavily criticized by the right. And one of the things that are common in most of the countries that we're going to see here is that there's a resurgence of the right conservatism. And in this case, Evo Morales represented the indigenous communities. So the right wing started accusing Evo Morales of fraud. This became very central in the last elections. So before even there was an actual outcome for the elections, both parties, Morales claimed that he was elected president. There was also claims of fraud from the opposing parties. So there was eventually, Evo Morales was obliged to resign and take refuge, I think, in Mexico, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And one of the main strategies was also the violence that was displayed and the military that was used to appease the nation. So that's a strategy that's common to all of these countries, the way the militaries have been used to encounter the protests. So there was this, actually something I'm gonna come back to in the end. I think it was Linz that goes over how democracy can also be understood as how the government deals with conflict. So the way the conflict is being dealt with is basically just violence and repression. So that speaks to how authoritarianism is sort of starting to take power again. In Chile, the protests were longer. They lasted for about a year and a half, and they were much more violent. Actually, the military, maybe, I don't know if this information got here, but they started using a specific strategy of aiming at the eyes of people. So a lot of people lost sight or one or both of their eyes. And this actually started as protests against an increase for public air transportation, but encompassed a lot of other things like high living costs, high cost medical service. How in Chile there's no public free educational system, so there was distress in the political class. And one important factor was the fact that the Chileans were contesting the last constitution that was built by dictator Pinochet. So a few of these things are also going to be seen in Peru. I forgot to mention for Bolivia, that flag over there, the Huipala flag, represents the indigenous people. So there's a lot of cultural symbolic elements that are dragged from one country to another. That one is one of the ones I'm going to mention again a little bit later. There's also the Colombian. They were also very violent. This began because President Duque has an opposition to the Truth and Reconciliation process. Most countries in South America have had heavy terrorism history, and most of them have started Truth and Reconciliation committees to investigate the crimes perpetrated by the government, the military forces. And in most countries, this has been met with heavy opposition. So there's this narrative where the government was dealing with terrorists, so any kind of violence they displayed was like sustained and was legitimate. And one more thing that's important here is that for Colombia, there was a heavy association between Duque, the president, a Brazilian drug lord, and the fact that this president, as well as many others, were trying to increase the economic sector by allowing international companies to dig for oil, copper, gold mining, which obviously threatens indigenous communities. That's also something that is happening in Brazil. And finally, for Ecuador, there's also been another social outburst that came about after Lazo's first year in office, which also brought higher insecurity, higher gas prices, higher food basic food basket costs. So it started as an economic thing, but speaks to the inequality that is so pervasive in South America. Here also, there was violence used against protests and civilians. So what are the common elements? One of the things we can see is that they're all democratically elected governments. So there is a large majority of the population that's being represented by these governments. And still, there's a very heavy opposition because one of the things that's going to happen in all of these countries is that the indigenous community that's starting in a way to be smaller because there's more mixing, ethnic mixing, and the class system is sort of eroding, what it means to be indigenous because these categories, ethnicity, race, are not pure in South America. So the indigenous is not just perceived by a racial thing, it's also perceived as tied to a specific education level, a class system. So this democracy is not exactly representative of what's been going on. It's usually competition between the worst of two evils. So people end up voting against a candidate instead of actually having someone that represents their interests. Another thing that's common to all of these countries is that right-wing policies for a more liberal market are starting to affect more heavily, indigenous people, poor people that are not, the general PBI, the general economy for the country can rise, but the inequality is so deep that a lot of people are noticing what they're lacking in contrast with other people in the same country. So this, I think I mentioned this the last class, like when we think of the difference between democratic and authoritarian governments, we think of political structures, but there's also an economic factor. There's also a cultural factor that's sort of entangled that makes it a little harder to be sure of what we mean when we say right wing or left wing, because the matter of values is also going to be big. I'm going to show a couple of images of that later on, but so the right wing that sort of operates with a more liberal market is not untied to other things like the lenience on the church, certain values that are considered important. So I'm going to go back to that. There are also human rights violations because of the government's use of police and military forces. So we can speak to a larger wave of anti-democratic strategies used by the government to remain in power. There's also a very wide claiming fraud strategy that I think, I'm not sure, was brought again by Trump, and that's been replayed in every single country. Like if you go into how all of these, the past presidents have reacted to the protests, they all claim the same things. They all claim on one side that the opposition is obviously fraudulent, so if they win by any chance, that's just fraud, so we shouldn't trust that. And that generates a bigger distrust in all the political establishment. And there's a big polarizing speech blaming any kind of opposition of being a terrorist or being a communist or being a socialist or wanting to destroy the country. So that's also something that's being replayed over and over. Anti-left-wing propaganda, there's a big blame on NGOs. Any kind of outside international actor is not seen as impartial. It's seen as some kind of imperialism that's draining on the country's independence. And there's obviously all kinds of conspiracy theories that even elected officials are saying outright, something that should be, I would think, regulated somehow, having an elected official, president, claiming false information to be right should be somehow controlled, but it's not. And there's some explicit Trump associations that are sort of influencing the way these different presidents are perceived. That picture is from Duque, Colombia's president, with Trump. So there's a very big similarity between the way Trump operates here and the way a lot of right-wing presidents have been operating in South America. So we get to Peru's case. One of the things I wanted to start with was, okay, what's Peru's regime history? Are we in any kind of democratic, wave or cycle? And this is not that precise because even trying to speak of regimes, there's been so many coups by so many different people that it was very hard to actually just make this little table. So we start with republicanism, but it's obviously led by military men when the country gained its independence. It eventually went into a military anarchism. We named it this because there were so many presidents each year. They facing coups over and over, that it was impossible to talk with any kind of regime. Then we moved into 20 years of a militarism that was sort of republican in the sense that there were elections, but mostly elections led by a specific Congress that was composed of a specific number of families. So it's sort of oligarchic, sometimes aristocratic. We moved into another kind of military, this kind of dictatorship, and if you see the militarism is just over and over and over and over. With democracy that begins to sustain itself, another militarism, military juntas, just one period of democracy, another military reformism. Here is where Velasco comes in. He's someone that's been mentioned here before. The only kind of dictatorship that was left being. And we eventually get to 1980 with the military reformism. When Velasco comes out of power, there's a very strong pressure to democratize the country. So we held first elections. And so the democratic regime would start here, but it's not an actual democratic regime. There were a lot of human rights violations. So the way the country dealt with that conflict that came from terrorism was still dictatorial in one way or another. So then came in the 1990s, Fujimori. He had a self-coup. Now, this is an important moment because it establishes what's going to happen now, like 20 years later.
I have a question. Would you say the human rights violations, that is in relation to Tiny Hut?
No. Well, yes, also that, but there were protests before. We gave indigenous the right to vote in 78, and actually the Shining Path started in 1980. So it was well before that, but it became established in the democracy because, you know, one of the things that I saw in one of the texts that I was going through the first few weeks here, they claimed that Peru was a democracy since 1980. And I was like, how can you call that a democracy per se if, you know, there's a military, paramilitary groups, you know, there's killings of civilians, but yeah, that's what I meant. So he had self-coup, and this part of
You
his
could add
thinking,
that there is one alternation in power between 1980 and 1992, between the
there's many,
Palau,
there's many.
Garcia.
Yeah, 1980,
Garcia.
it was all democratic in the sense that they were all elected officially. So 1980 to 85 was Belaunde, 85 to 90 was Garcia. I'm gonna get to that in a minute.
Yeah, okay.
So this part specifically, I was saying it's important because what happened was in the first round of elections, what we determined is for a president to gain control, he has to have more than 50% of the votes. Like nobody ever gets 50% of the votes, except of course Fujimori during the dictatorship, where he got more than 50%. But before that, the first round determines how many congressmen are gonna represent each party. So what you can get is in the first round of elections, what happened was a majority of the Congress that is not going to support the president because the president actually wins for the second round. So you can get a Congress that's, let's say, right-wing leaning, and you can get a president that's left-wing leaning, depending on the outcome of the second round. So what Fujimori did, because the Congress wasn't letting him govern, was to dissolve Congress. So that's when he did the self-coup, proclaimed himself the absolute power, reinstated a different Congress with his own allies, and then he, you know.
You actually included the Fujimori's term before the self-coup under 1980, 1992.
Yeah,
right?
it's
That's,
sort of.
there's 3 presidencies in that particular period.
Yes. Yes. So he governs, actually this is around 2000. In 2000, there was a lot of international pressure because international observers saw there was a rigged election. So he was forced to resign. He's very famous for resigning via fax, which is today's equivalent of tweeting himself out of office. And then we started a transitional government of democracy, and this is where we are now, which is here. This is the list of presidents we've had for the past 20 years. So it started off relatively stable. We had a first government. This is a very interesting story I cannot go into, but he represented indigenous communities. Since we are a very racist country, we named him the Harvard Yama because he was from the Andes. He was, you know, indigenous, but he went to Harvard. So this is actually to show that disparity that I was mentioning earlier, that class, race, the place into if someone should be in power or not. Then we have Garcia, which he actually had a first government that produced the biggest hyperinflation we've had in Peru, over 2,000%. And the only reason why he won was because he was actually opposed by Humala, who was also in the military. So people wanted to vote against the military to kind of avoid going into that. But then Humala got to a second round with
But
Fujimori.
Obama is elected, right? It's not a
Yeah,
coup.
but for the second one,
Okay, but it's not a coup.
no, there were no coups. There has been no coups recently.
Right.
So then we moved to PPK. He was only in office for 2 years because he was accused of being, there's this clause that I'm gonna mention. Yeah, the moral clauses are reason for vacancy. So there's this law where if a president is not deemed morally, fit to be in office, he can be deposed. But the obvious question is, what does that mean? What does that mean to be morally,
Who is by who, and then who makes the,
Congress?
Congress under, that's what they.
So it depends on who's in Congress. So
Majority vote, right, or 2/3?
yeah, there's a vote, but there's also coalitions.
But it's a simple majority.
No, there has to be, yeah, no, it's simple. There has to be 87 out of, I think, 120. So it's not just,
After Fujimori is only one chamber anyway, right?
yes,
So it's in one chamber, has to be majority vote.
yes.
Okay. To declare the presidency vacant, right, that's the phrase.
yes, but morally, it is really amazing, it's interesting.
But that's constitution, it's in the constitution, right?
That's one of the things that I was
I'm
gonna.
sorry, but
No, it's okay. It's one of the questions that I was left, is how do you, because one of the main factors that defines a democracy is the rule of law. But if the rule of law is so broad and so, it can be interpreted in so many ways, like what's the limit to actually consider democracy?
But there is if I could just, it's wonderful what you presented, it's great, but just let me, there is impeachment in Peru. Impeachment is a constitutional provision as well, but it's very difficult to achieve because you require, right? Some of them are impeached,
Oh, yes.
but declaring it vacant is a different institution. It's supposed to be easier to declare the presidency vacant than to impeach the president. Okay, I'm sorry.
All of them have been impeachments.
Well, they actually been impeachments,
Yes.
right? Okay.
So the Congress impeached,
Impeached in those
PPK.
cases. In those cases. Right,
Yes.
but it's supposed to be more difficult, but they did it anyway.
it was supposed to be difficult, but they have found a way to do it
Right.
over and over and over and over again. So what happened prior to the impeachment was, Pepe Kapuczynski was affiliated to the Odebrecht corruption cases. And also there was this, it's hard to say anything definitive about this because this is just things that happen and you don't have an actual explanation for it. But what we understand is that he made a deal with the Fujimoristas. So he actually let Fujimori, our former dictator, out of jail. That lasted for a little while, but he was impeached right after. We think it was like a play to try to stay in power so that Congress wouldn't impeach them, but it happened anyway. So when he, the first vice president, got into office, he was also, and this is where this happens, they tried to impeach him, but he dissolved Congress hours before. So then we had a president that lasted for 2 hours, which actually wasn't the president. He became just a meme because they swore her into office by a Congress that was no longer legally in action.
Because I got confused because before Fujimori, there was two chambers,
No,
and
no,
before Fujimori 79, there were two.
70,
And under those conditions, it required, like the United States, impeachment required a Senate. But after 79, there's no Senate. And so impeachment became easy. That was the reason for my confusion.
Okay.
But, to me, it seems that this, of course, for whatever reason they can impeach, but this moral clause seems to be so broad. And then, I don't know, to me, it seems that if there is something like this in the Constitution, then it should be for the judiciary even. But then it's not. It's
But I mean, if you look at the US, it says high crimes and misdemeanors. for impeachment?
Yes,
I mean, do you know exactly what would be enough
No.
for a high crime?
For a high crime, yes, but for a misdemeanor,
What?
for a high crime, I think it's easier, but for a
High
misdemeanor,
crime is, exactly, for misdemeanor, you don't know. And high crime, it's not clear, because treason would be clearly high crime. But would, for example, beating up a person which is criminal in the United States, would that be a high crime? Probably not, right? But it's a question of interpretation.
that's a problem. That's one of the
that
problems.
is true. That is-
And the
It's
one,
not obvious, that the US would be any more, I mean, probably somebody could look at impeachment clauses across constitutions, and some may be better than this. But a lot of them are like this.
Yes, if, yeah. The
In other
procedures-
words, to make the point, in parliamentary systems, there is no confidence vote and the executive is gone. In this system, that's not possible, right?
no, there is, so
For the prime minister, there is a no confidence vote.
no, for the president. That's why Castillo got voted out.
That's the moral clause, yeah.
I can check.
That is a moral clause.
No, not the moral clause, the moral clause is the actual law that facilitates the Congress for impeachment, but
But this, we're
The
talking
matter
about
of
two different
trust.
things. Impeachment, declaring vacancy, and no confidence. They're two different things.
yes. So the matter of trust is, the president sets up his cabinet of ministers and the Congress has to vote on the trust issue. If they vote no from the Fujimori's constitution, if they vote no 3 times, the president is allowed to dissolve Congress. So that's what, a lot of people try to do, and that's what happened with Castillo. So there we get to the balance of power between the executive and the legislative. What's been happening throughout most of this time is that the president has not been allowed to govern because he has a Congress that votes actively against him and doesn't allow for a lot of projects to actually take shape or start. So what Castillo did is one of the things that you read about in one of the news. It's been called political suicide because he was being met with a Congress that did not allow for any of his ministers to work. So he tried to dissolve Congress. He tried to do a self-coup. But the difference is the economic situation was completely different, and the high class was against him being of indigenous communities. Actually, I'm gonna get into this in a minute, but the media played a very large role in this. There were a lot of symbolisms that they called him a burro, not a donkey, which is a term used for rural people. It's not used for anyone that's white. So
Just one more thing, is that various countries that are represented around this thing. Does any of your countries have a dissolution power for the presidency? Because this is pretty unusual, right? That is, not only is there impeachment and declaration of vacancy on one side, Congress doing it to the executive, but the executive has power to dissolve Congress and call new elections. I know that in Peru that's the case. I'm not aware, certainly the United States doesn't have that, right? President cannot, France, and I should be better at on this, the Fifth Republic has some kind of dissolution clause. That is, the French president can dissolve under some conditions. I don't know the rule now. But think about this problem in Peru. On the one side, the president can be removed by a congressional vote, whether it's impeachment or declaration of vacancy. And the president can dissolve Congress too, which is really pretty unusual in terms of the constitutional arrangement.
that's because Fujimori stated that in his constitution, so he would be able to do it later on.
Did the one before did not have
No.
dissolution? It did not.
No.
So this is added into Fujimori's, this is 79 innovation.
Which is one of the reasons that,
But of course, he dissolved Congress.
Yeah.
He
but it
dissolved-
was a self-coup because he was unconstitutional.
But it was not a, so at that time, he didn't have the opportunity for a constitutional removal, so he did the self-coup.
And he,
Right.
he stated that as a law in the constitution.
Okay, that's my understanding is a little different. I mean, but it could be wrong, is that there was a legal dissolution before 92, which has to do with Parliament not passing three laws, right? Some kind of rule of this kind, the parliament could be dissolved if three successive laws were which were presented by the president were refused. So there were three refusals. Then there was a, but of course, that to an important extent was an illusion, because even if Parliament refused the law the president proposed, the Senate could refuse it if Parliament accepted it. So in a way, it never happened that there were three successive laws turned out which then allowed the president to legally dissolve. So Fujimori uses illegal, so in other words, a coup. And then after him, the Constitution allows for dissolution. That's what you're saying.
Mhm.
After 92, the Constitution explicitly allows for dissolution by the president, and at the same time has vacancy declaration and impeachment on the other side,
Mhm.
which is pretty unusual if you actually look at. I mean, I think in the room you can talk about Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and the United States. I don't know what other presidential regimes are represented in the class, but I am pretty sure that if all of them have some kind of impeachment, that you can bet on that every presidential regime must have some provision for, and Korea would be too, you have a president, right? So how you remove the president would be a positive step. In every setting, you would have to have it, but to have a obverse rule of the president dissolving Congress,
I think,
I don't think it's represented anywhere in this.
I think it was in the constitutional, in the constitution, in the Shah's regime, it was in the constitutional.
Well, it's a
Because,
monarchy,
yes,
so,
yes, because Mossadegh, no,
in other words, removal of the Shah,
no, the prime minister could dissolve the parliament.
but that's true for every parliamentary system. In other
Well,
words, the
in a way,
parliamentary system, the prime minister who does not have confidence can dissolve. That's the nature of the parliamentary system, is that the prime minister can be removed through a vote of no confidence,
Yes,
and the prime minister can dissolve and go for a new election.
Yes.
But the presidential system,
no,
that's the point. And Iran, weirdly enough, because it's a fairly autocratic rule of the Shah, nevertheless, has formally a parliamentary structure.
yes,
There's no president
no,
until the end of the Shah.
yes.
Do you have, by the way, today, in the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, any kind of impeachment for the president?
Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
And does the president have any right of dissolution?
No.
Does not?
No.
Sorry, but I mean, in some ways, the uniqueness of this, I want to make sure that people get the uniqueness of this constitutional
Yes, yes.
structure. And it's Mr. Fujimori's constitution on the top of it, right? That's what you're saying.
And which is.
Whatever existed before, it wasn't the same way.
No.
Well, you gotta be careful, right? 1979 is the constitution that is under which till 92 Peru is governed.
Mhm.
Before then, you had the military regime. So 79 is the constitution, and then 92 Fujimori self-grew another constitution. And what you're describing here, this crisis of governability that you have up there, is basically under the Fujimori Constitution.
Yes,
That's the structure, the formal structure, which produces it. Sorry,
that's actually one of the main claims of the protests right now, is to get a new constitution that's been
this
sparking.
is a bad constitution.
I mean, yes.
I mean, it's a constitution that creates the problem. You say crisis of
That's just one
governability.
of the problems in
It's
this constitution.
2001 to 2002, you have a crisis of governability. That is not what you would call a very successful constitution, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is your own presentation. What place can you say crisis of governability of that? Let's hope United States is not going to have 3-1 like that soon. The Republicans are working very hard on it, but this is pretty unusual. Look how many presidents 1, 2, 3. Well, PPK means what?
Pepe Kakuczynski.
That's a party.
No, he's president. All of these are
Oh,
president. It's a
PPK
very,
is a person.
it's very presidential system.
Okay.
There are
So
no parties.
Toledo,
involved.
Castillo, Mala, PPK, Vizcarra, Arauz, Merino, Sagasti, Castillo, and Boulevard are currently. I think that's a world record.
Maybe.
No, I think it would be
I can check.
tough to imagine, we have some unstable countries represented in this class, and unstable histories represented in this class. This, I think, is a world record.
Yeah,
I mean, I
think
think,
that-
I wonder if that's to kind of get a sense of what the problem here structurally. Constitutions don't always produce rights, even when they're bad, but this one certainly contributed. Sorry, Alexandra,
No, it's fine.
but you kind of entered into the area which I work on, so, but not meant as any kind of criticism, it's wonderful what you presented.
Can I ask you before you, no, just one question, because the different, there's no party reference, and I know that party references in Peru are.
Parties are, there's maybe 2 or 3 parties. All of them are reconstituted and dissolved with basically every election process.
But I'm wondering, because I know that is the case currently, but also the APRA historically is.
He's not here.
Garcia wasn't the APRA?
Yes, but it's a complicated issue because the APRA started out with Garcia's first government embodied that, a left-leaning equality government. But for the second term, I mean, he does come from the APRA, but it's a completely different set of values and norms. So
No, that's why, but my question was, is there, would it be correct in a way to say that there is, after Garcia and probably with Humala, there is sort of a crisis of at least whatever system of parties that there was during most of the 21st century, or during most of the 20th century,
definitely.
at least whatever party system, which was very weak, but at least there was the APRA and Fujimori.
Alexander, help with this a little bit. Could you say something about the opera and its origins?
I don't know that
I
much.
think people in this group, perhaps Javier and Luis will know. But opera is a big thing in Peru.
Was.
Was, but what,
That's
When did it-
what I was trying to.
when did
It's
it,
no more. It doesn't say anymore that because it had such an important role
The
before.
APRA,
okay,
okay, I'm just trying to translate all the
no,
information. I'm not an expert in party systems and
No.
I don't know that
but
much
when,
about
when
this.
did the opera start?
Uh,
1930s,
no, I don't think so.
20s?
APR,
But it was never in government, right? It was
No,
never
in
in
government,
government.
but
It was in the 80s.
it was always contesting
old movement.
elections, but it was always left leaning, and that's most of the
Del
party.
Torre is the founder, right?
Yeah,
Javier Del Torre.
yes, Ayala de Torre.
And I think that he actually goes back to the 30s, but could be wrong. And eventually,
But yes, after that, the party system pretty much collapsed, and all the regions where the APRA was big have been replaced by other. Actually, gonna show this in a minute. By Acuña's party, he has a few universities up north, so he's gained a lot of the voters for the APRA, and different parts of Fujimorismo is also, they're also gonna take over. So the APRA is not that big anymore, but it was important during the history. So just to mention a couple of things, there's a growing representation of indigenous people that has played a big part in how indigenous people start fighting for different rights that they have never been accessed before. And the use of police force for protest suppression that actually goes back at least since 2016. So since this very strong crisis of governability started, there were protests, many of them. Actually, many of them impeached after Justice Davis because people started to get killed just by being in protest sites or being near protest sites. So people that weren't even necessarily involved in the protest got killed. And that remained in place throughout the rest of the history. So after that, we get to the elections that produce the actual crisis that we have today. Pedro Castillo, who actually came into office, was not known or recognized by anyone. If you go back to the polls that were measuring who was probably gonna be elected, he didn't show up in any of them. Nobody knew who he was. He was a rural teacher from the Andes, so he had no actual political experience. He was an activist for the education movement, but he was not actually a politician. And in the first round, he managed to get 18%. Now, the people who were actually poised to win were pretty much all of these. So we had Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, the last dictator. She also got the second place with 13%, and most of the other people that were headed to win the elections were all right-wing coalitions. So one thing that happens a lot in Peru, it happened a few years before when we dissolved Congress. People thought we were going to vote for certain more or less established parties. And actually the party that won after the dissolution of Congress was a party nobody thought of. The FREPAP was actually a very religious conservative group. And they managed to get a majority in Congress for a few years. So nobody knew this was coming. He just appeared in first place. And when he went into the second round with the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, same thing that always happens. Which one is the worst? Which one is not that bad? And there was a very strong anti-Fujimori vote because of the history of dictatorship, but they also managed to get almost 50% of the votes. So that says a lot about what people care about, culturally speaking. People are more interested in economic development than any kind of justice or equality inside the political parties.
The column on the right is presidential outcome or congressional outcome.
Presidential. So Rafael López Aliaga, he's a very conservative. He actually
Right, but what I'm saying is that to understand the Peruvian situation, you also have to have the congressional outcome.
the congressional outcome comes out of this.
Resembles that,
Yes,
resembles that.
from the first round.
So take a look, that's, a significant part of that is in terms of party theory, is how many parties there are.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
No, these are just the
It doesn't
highest
add
voted.
up to 100, by the way.
No, this is not the high. These are only the highest voted. There are a lot more. There are like at least 14.
So there are that many in Congress, that
Um,
many parties represented in Congress.
Yes, a couple more actually.
Because
Yes.
obviously I can see it doesn't add up to 100 what you have over there.
Mhm.
So you have a level of fragmentation of Congress, which is extremely unusual.
Yeah.
What's the electoral system that produces that, by the way?
What do you mean?
What kind, is it proportional?
Yes.
Every
proportional
party
to the
gets seats
percentages
according to,
stated on the
I
first
don't
round.
mean the presidential,
No.
I mean the
For Congress.
parliamentary.
For Congress,
Congress,
yeah.
yeah.
It depends on the quantity they get of votes in the first round. So if they get 20%,
Well, I
they
think
get
you've gotta add those into the overall number. So you would have to probably add up to 100, I'm not even sure. But in any case, that means that, whatever proportion you get in a vote is the number of,
there's a
up
number
to
of
the
seats.
threshold of 1, right? Because you can't have less than 1%.
Mhm.
No, I don't know how many.
It's exactly, they have to get more than 5% to be able to have representation in Congress. So beyond 5%, it
So
depends.
there's a 5% threshold.
Yes,
Okay, so the electoral system is proportional with a 5% threshold, which means, but all these parties get in, right? But there are others that don't get in.
Two questions. This party for this candidate on the far right, is YL.
Denny Lescano, he used to be a congressman. So what happened with Fujimorismo was that most of the people that were involved in the party sort of scattered and joined different parties. So this is one of the ones that were very heavy into Fujimorismo, but when he saw Keiko wasn't winning, he formed his own party.
And regarding Pedro Castillo, how do you interpret that? So you said no one knows him and he leads the first round. Is that a media
Because
question?
yes,
How do you explain
but
that?
not just that.
Okay.
So the same thing that happened with PREPAP when the dissolution of Congress happened was that when I say nobody knows him, the question is who's nobody? So nobody actually is represented by the media and by the higher classes. So when, I don't know how they do the polling. They should be more representative than it actually happens, but it didn't show in any polls. He wasn't present in any kind of media outlets. But what happens is the the country's so centralized that whatever happens outside of Lima is just not known in Lima.
Alexander, they voted simultaneously for Congress and the president.
Yes.
Of course, the presidential has two rounds,
Mhm.
the congressional is just one round, the proportion is decided. Is it an open list?
Yes.
Like you voted, right? So you know that you put down a party
Yes.
and
And you can-
you put down a candidate too.
You can, or you can just vote for the party. You have those two options,
So it's up to you whether you actually put down,
a number.
but the people who do put down determine pretty much who is gonna be picked up the party's list.
Yes, but I
See,
think,
in other countries, the party list is a numbered hierarchical number.
it's
so
also like that in Peru.
Here it's determined by the vote.
The thing is, yeah, legally it's determined by the vote, but most people don't vote for specific people.
I
They just vote for
understand.
the party.
But what I'm saying is that, given the fact that some do,
Mhm.
they play a very big role
Yes,
in picking who actually gets it.
yes.
But you can see, 5%, I didn't realize there's a 5% cutoff, so it could even be more fragmentary than it now is. But it is pretty, it's capable of fairly high level of fragmentation. So you're picking a president, a two-round thing, who's going to represent just one of these things, right? So Pedro Castillo, whatever his party name was, represents one such party, and he gets presidency, whereas all these parties get a proportional number of seats in parliament. That's the crucial part. Highly majoritarian on the one end, and highly fragmentary on the other end. I don't know, everybody comes from countries where you have elections, so you probably know what that means. I know that around the table, elections can mean somewhat different things. Thinking of Iran, right? But in any case, this is an unusual structure. Is it entirely absent in Latin America, Luis and Javier? Do you anywhere in Latin America have a combination of this type of fragmentary proportional system and this type of presidency? Well, you have presidency everywhere. So that's majoritarian one way or the other. No, in some countries, the plurality can get the presidency. A majoritarian is this where you have to have a second round. But you have such high level of fragmentation, not in Mexico.
No, we don't have,
Not in Argentina.
we don't have.
So this is kind of unusual in Latin American terms.
So this is the president who got impeached in 2022, and she was the first vice president, and now she's president. As soon as she got into office, she promised elections for 2024, then she rolled back on that.
Sorry, I have to, does Boluarte run on the same ticket with Castillo
Yes.
originally?
Yes.
So the president and the vice president are basically one ticket, like in the United States. You vote simultaneously for both. She's vice president because, did he pick her?
Yes.
Did Castillo
Well,
pick?
not Castillo per se, because he comes from a party where Cerrón, he was actually in charge of the party. He was not legally allowed to run because he was convicted of crimes against humanity, which actually Urresti also was. He's now in jail during the terrorism
Are they
era.
from the same party or are they?
No, no,
They're
no,
a
no,
coalition within an electoral.
no, no, it was, let's say, more or less a coalition.
Okay. So they're not ideologically paired originally.
The thing is, if we speak of ideology, there's a lot of intersections. So you can have the political intersection, but there's also the values intersection.
She's indigenous too?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't put it here, but yeah, she was. And that was actually why people voted for this ticket, because there was a lot of
Two
representation.
indigenous candidates.
They were too indigenous. So one of the things that happened as soon as he came into office was Congress wouldn't let him govern. He couldn't pass any laws. He couldn't make any
Okay.
decisions. They kept, denying the trust. So he tried to dissolve Congress. It backfired.
Well, that's the rest of the story, right?
Sure.
Okay, no, but you haven't told it, right? So maybe we should say something about it, right? I mean, he's elected in 21 and he's out by, as you said
22.
before, 22, right? So how did that happen? I mean, I should not put you,
No, I get it.
but I think that really, I would suspect Luis and Javier know. And I have a little bit of an idea, but the rest of the class actually does not know how things went from Castillo's presidency to Boluarte's presidency. It's a kind of adventure.
Is
So
your
like my
question?
question, yeah, like my question is, from what I remember, they were accusing him of corruption
Yes,
and they tried to impeach him twice.
Yes.
And they failed.
there were no
Because of the
proof.
moral clause here.
No, there were no proof of any kind of.
No, yeah, but they, using the moral clause was what they were trying to accuse him of this corruption charge, right?
Yes.
And then, after the second time, he's failed to be impeached, then there's a third attempt, and that's when he decides.
No, there was no third attempt. That's why it's called a political suicide, because he could have waited if he
Uh-huh.
didn't.
And then that's when he tries to.
Self-coup.
To self-coup, and then they use the moral clause after he.
No,
tried
it's
to-
actually, no, in that case, they don't use the moral clause because there's a legal precedent. He can't dissolve Congress
Ah.
without it being constitutional. Because
Okay.
the third, they
And
never
this
got.
was an attempt at a constitutional dissolution or
Yes.
unconstitutional?
That's also a
That's a
discussion.
big political question.
So legally speaking, it was a constitutional resolution.
It was legally a constitutional.
No, wait. No. Legally speaking, it was not.
Unconstitutional.
Yes, because he didn't wait for the third denial of trust. But what's being discussed, and one of the reasons the protest started when he was impeached was that people were claiming that he be brought back because he's the only representation of the indigenous communities that we have. So there's the legal political side, but there's also the legitimacy question.
Okay, that's, I'm sorry for it coming in, but this is, I think, I'm interested in the whole class.
Sure.
A couple of Latin Americans here, aside from you, who have no problem understand all this. This is actually a jungle,
Oh,
right? And two attempts at impeachment.
Mhm.
They fail.
Mhm.
There was gonna be a third attempt for sure, and he preemptively dissolved because there are rights on both sides. They can impeach, but he can dissolve. But he has rules under which he could dissolve. And now the rule seems to say that there has to be 3 attempts at removing him
Yes.
before he dissolves.
Yes.
And there were only 2.
No, not attempts at removing him. There have to be 3 denials of trust by the Congress to his proposal. of
No
ministers.
confidence, 3
Yeah.
no confidence votes, and there have only been 2. However, and this is, she says to make a subtle point, which I'm sure that in Peru is a very tough topic of discussion, is that though strictly speaking, I don't mean to make a joke of
No.
it. Strictly speaking, when you're a legal positivist, it's not legal after 2 such attempts of distrust or no confidence for him to do it. But in terms of the spirit of the law, which is what you call legitimacy, in terms of the spirit of the law, what he's doing is right, because this is already means that the system is breaking down, and he must do something, and a new election would actually try to restore the system.
Exactly.
So what you're arguing is that though in a narrow sense illegal, in the sense of the spirit of the law or legitimacy, it makes sense for him to do it under those conditions. Or
I-
just for
Yeah,
him, not make,
I'm not saying I support that, but I understand.
I'm not trying to have either one of us take a side, but I think what the class to understand is there's an argument on both sides.
Mhm.
Narrow legal legitimacy on one side, and at least arguably, narrow legality on the one side, and arguably legitimacy and the purpose of the law on the other side. And arguably, those are 2, let's say, justifications, possible justifications. Removal on the side of Boluarte and eventually Congress, removal of the president, and on his side, the fact that removal didn't turn out to be legitimate.
Can I,
So people get it.
just on this question, was it the same kind of a division among the population, the people, or no? The legitimacy.
That's your presentation of
Yes,
how
no.
the population
No,
responds.
for sure, but but generally, the public opinion and a large section of the population on the side of the president here or on the side of the public.
You're gonna present that, right? I mean, because you're gonna have a popular movement.
So that's where the indigenous communities come in. The indigenous communities were behind Pedro Castillo. So the protest actually starts in different sectors that are outside of the, so Arequipa, Ayacucho, Cusco, provinces that are more represented by indigenous communities. They were behind Pedro Castillo, but the higher class systems were not. So one thing I would
Fascinating, yeah, right, I mean, it's really, this is what you call a constitutional crisis, you know?
Yeah.
There are other constitutional crises which are not quite as deep, but here, Congress, against the president, arguments, justification on both sides, right? And in that sense, each justification can lead to mobilization. How it happens is this, right?
Exactly. So for to speak about the legitimacy issue, the media has played a huge role. So most of these are printed media. They're all basically owned by the same corporation that's composed of a few rich families. So most of the media was not just printed, but also television was very anti-Castillo since the very elections. So we had a lot of different campaigns for disaccreditation, comparing him to Venezuela, Chavez, Maduro, saying, you know, Castillo's gonna come in, he's gonna convert the country to communism, everything's gonna go to hell. So the thing.
They don't compare him to Fujimori, right?
No, because Fujimori is actually.
Which would be logical if you're actually on the right, because Fujimori carried out a dissolution too,
Yes,
right? But they don't do it because they are allied with Fujimori's party,
exactly.
right?
Because of the economic,
Right,
the economic
right,
constitution. So
right.
a lot of the things that Fujimori introduced in his constitution were privatization.
Right,
So
I get it, yeah.
the education system got privatized, and this polarization was very strong. Like since the beginning, just this first candidate, the only left-wing candidate, got less than 8%, was Veronica Mendoza. And since the campaign, she was proclaimed as a terrorist that was also going to bring communism. So any kind of left-leaning politician is automatically chastised into we cannot possibly vote for this person. So what happens is, it's small because it's in Spanish anyway, but I pulled the covers from different, the most important papers. This were from the day that during the protests, they broke into a university. In Peru, the universities have a legal status that precludes the government from having any kind of interference in how they run. And a lot of people that came from other districts or other provinces were housed in some of the public national universities. So what the military did was they broke into the university and they arrested everyone with absolutely no actual charges, but they were accused of being terrorists. They were accused of a lot of things that they have no proof of. So what's interesting is if you go to the covers, you can clearly see the polarization. There's no neutral information. There's actually no information. There's just a political. So this is one of the most important. It says, so the cover says, people who are in favor of the province are meeting Castillo in jail. This is the only left-leaning paper. It says there's unconstitutional repression, but all the others are basically just claiming that people are out of control, that order is being imposed. So there's a very strong reason why there's such a polarization in our country where most people cannot be allowed to express any kind of opinion that goes against the status quo because they're automatically assumed to be terrorists, communists, and these replace some of the strategies we've seen in other countries, including the US, which is hate speech, the excuse for violence. You know, these people are gonna ruin the country, so we need to kill them before they do that. The fake news and fake information. Actually, most of the main outlets of information have been producing fake information. the police have been planting evidence, and when that information comes out, it gets removed, and nobody talks about it.
Listen, who is in control, of police? That is who? Is it the president?
No, it depends.
It depends.
So what happened, for example, what happened here when Vizcarra went into power, he was the first president of the vice president for Kuczynski. Kuczynski got removed from office because of the moral clause. And when he came in, before this happened, he was speaking explicitly about dissolving Congress. And what we know is that he met with some of the military generals before he dissolved Congress. So what that says to us is that there's no explicit allegiance, but they have to work out who the military is gonna back up. So what happens with the current protests is that what Boluarte did was increase the expenditure of the military. They increased the budget for police and military, even though we just went through a lot of crises of food and the climate. So there's this whole thing, I can't really go into it, but there was a big storm that hit Peru. Apparently she knew it was gonna happen, there were no preparations, a lot of people got left without water, without homes, and right after that, when she was claiming there was no budget to actually help these people, they increased the budget of the military against the protests.
No, finally I realized that PPK is Kuczynski. It's Kuczynski, you know, he had this nice Polish name.
He's white.
Actually he's German, or at least German family, but Polish names in Germany are common. I didn't know who PPK was, and I finally realized I'm missing Kuczynski, who's just, in terms of names, doesn't quite fit into this setting, but
Even before, if you go to the last names of presidents before in the oligarchy and the aristocracy, they were all foreign.
it's common that
Yes.
you have foreign names.
They-
Right?
It's more common that they be Spanish,
Yeah, I would think,
but
right.
so actually in the campaign for Kuczynski, he was labeled presidente de lujo, like a luxury president, just because he was white and affiliated with the United States government. I think he did a couple of consultations for presidents here. So
See, the thing I remember about him explicitly is that he releases Fujimori from jail.
yes,
So one thing, because of political alliance, not because of particular affinity, he releases,
no, actually,
which was a big event.
he had to flee during the military coup of Fujimori. He had to flee in the trunk of a car. So
Oh.
it's
Well, whatever.
yes,
But
whatever.
go back for a second, just to let me get it back. Grupo El Comercio is right wing, right?
Yes. Now,
What?
now. You know, yeah,
It wasn't then?
El Comercio was actually very famous for contesting Fujimori's dictatorship.
I see.
But yeah, he got bought out by, I think,
But this
Danilo
picture is
Rosales.
trying to portray Castillo as a
Oh, yeah,
linked to terrorism and
Yes.
so on, yeah.
yeah, but it
And
switched to the right.
Republica is left wing?
Yes,
Okay. You don't have to go through all of them, but they're the most famous.
yeah,
Okay.
these are most of the most
I
famous.
just want to get it right because, you know, this is,
And there, again, of the day after the eruption into the University of San Marcos, which is a public university that was housing protesters. So this is what they showed. Some of them did not speak of that at all, and some of them just blamed the
is
people.
the language, because you begin with political polarization.
Oh, yeah, I can go into,
But then you say hate speech. Are those things said on both sides or
Yes.
just on one side? Both sides.
both sides.
Both sides.
The right is being claimed as fascist, which it may in some cases be, not necessarily, and the
Right.
left as terrorists or communists. So yeah, it goes both
Or
sides.
terrorists.
Yes. So there are a couple of neutral, actually, La República is sort of neutral.
Yes.
It's not 100% neutral, but it's more informative and a little bit less opinionated. So we get into the protests. So most of the stories that I sent are about this. So I'm not gonna go into this very much, but I wanted to show a couple of things. This is one of the most representative images of these last protests because an indigenous woman that has absolutely no arms, just arms, not the word, weapons, no weapons. And she's just waving a flag, and the police are anti-riot police, so they have weapons, they have shields, and this is basically what represents what's going on right now. Because you see, the picture's not very clear here, but the protesters are at most have like rocks and slingshots, and the military is actually holding military grade weapons. So there have been found a lot of, the bullet caskets, like for military purposes on a lot of situations. This was just, I thought it was pretty, impactful. I actually took this picture. It was an indigenous woman holding a sign in English, and in Spanish it says, "Let's see if in English Miraflores understands." Miraflores is one of the wealthiest districts in Lima.
Is it implied that the right is supported by the United States or?
It's not implied, it's explicit.
I mean,
Actually-
but that, I'm just saying in terms of that slogan.
Oh, yes. There's a very strong connection between high class and economic wealth and the right.
And US,
Yeah, the US troops are actually, I think, still in Peru. right
I'm
now.
not contesting it either way, but just, wanna know why in English.
Oh, that's because during, okay, so during before the second round, when people were denouncing that Castillo was a terrorist, a communist and whatnot, the stupidest campaign took place where high-class people started using slogans in English. So they started using shirts that said "better dead than red," which is very, but it was ridiculous in a Spanish
No, I mean,
context.
I think it's an important point because Latin Americans, all three of you first know this from Latin American countries, whether Brazil or Argentina or Mexico. But the role of the US Embassy in the United States in some of these conflicts is Mexico, of course.
Yeah.
God is so far away and the United States is so near, right? So this is, it's obvious. And I think that in that sense, to me, as I see as signed in English, you say that because it's a wealthy, neighborhood.
No, but this is an indigenous woman. She's
No, I
speaking
think it's a woman.
to speak to
But-
a section of the population.
Right, who
That don't listen to.
who thinks in English or something like that. I'm kidding, but it cannot be an accident that implies foreign support
No, it's not.
for the other side.
I think that what the sign says is like, they use the English language as a point of distinction. And it's like, well, maybe if we say it in a language that makes you feel superior, maybe you will listen to
Well,
us.
that's what I
Kind of
mean,
like-
yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
And also it is maybe also this the language that everyone all over
I
the
can't
world,
hear you.
that everyone all over the world can understand as well. I can understand it.
Yeah, but this is aimed at a specific group. It's not an international, phrase. It's aimed at the Miraflores district.
I mean, the relationship
but
of
it's
the
a-
military,
Yeah, yes,
right, to the, regime that replaces Castillo, the government, is, might you say, that is linked, now to the military. So when it comes to the military, then of course, even though in Peru, this is a little special, because not all the military governments have been, friendly to the United States, but still, in the contemporary setting, that kind of would be assumed that military, well, that also means support of the biggest power in the hemisphere, right? And so I think in that sense, it's kind of natural, right, to also address the United States. You were raising your hand now.
Yeah, I think kind of understand irony also in South Korea, because in South Korea, there is a two-party just like the Republic or Democracy, but Republic is actually very close to the United States, and Democratic Party is close to China.
I mean, this is international, except that I've just read this excellent book by Ginsburg, where it shows that there are now really two hegemonic blocs in the world. But Peru belongs to the American one. So in any case, if you have a military coup, or you have a unconstitutional removal, or you have a neoliberal imposition of some kind, and it's kind of natural for people to say United States, right? I mean, this is,
Yeah.
but no, in Iran, that would not be
No,
the
no, but
case.
yes,
Or
but in
China,
South
right,
America,
but-
I mean,
But Latin America,
yes.
it is.
Korea too.
Well, and in Korea, and that's what I'm saying, right, that in Korea too, that would be, would be natural to think that US has something to do with it, right? And of course, even if you read the Whitehead piece, which we distributed, or which you read, you see that the US has done a lot I mean, the Pinochet coup is the most famous, but it is by no means the only one.
No, Peru was part of.
Even the support of the Shah, even the support of the Shah.
Yes, of course, no, yeah, the 1950 truth.
So the
Street
popular movement in
was,
1979
was the first one, was the
also
first.
focused on the United States, whose embassy is occupied, right? So think about it, this
Yes.
is not, it's not an insignificant matter. And
No.
Americans, somehow have to face this as an issue.
Yeah.
Because it's an issue in, look around the table, right? How many countries this can come up? Brazil is too big maybe and too independent for this to be such a big factor. But in Peru or Korea, I can see it. And, did the US Embassy take a position, by the way, Alexandra? I don't mean to really put you on the spot. I mean, you don't have to encyclopedic knowledge of this crisis. But sometimes the role of the US Embassy, I think the US Embassy condemned Fujimori's stealth coup. I'm pretty sure that the US did not support 92 autogovernment. But I think that in terms of the Castillo case, which is different,
I would say it may have done that because Fujimori's economic policies were aligned with the US interests.
right, but this is of course my son's argument against me, is that bring back the economy, bring back property, bring back the interest of corporations. And of course, I don't do that, because Castillo threatened nationalization,
Yes,
he did.
yes.
So Julian, my son, will be very happy with you, because he actually threatened, right? Threatened.
It wasn't in his government plan, the nationalization of a lot of.
Well, that's 1 year, so it can only be a plan, but I think that would be,
Not only that, one of the weird things that happened when Castillo went into power, at first he started placing a lot of people from his native city in different government positions. They started to
infiltrate.
no, renunciar.
Say this-
They started to resign because they weren't actually prepared for those kind of jobs. And after that, he started changing a lot of his policies, and he actually started instituting prime ministers of different ministries that were aligned with the right. So it's a very complex issue.
By the way, people want, Peru, when did they copy the French version of presidentialism with a prime minister? When did they?
We don't have a prime minister, we have a
You have a-
first minister.
You have a president of government,
Yes.
but that's a prime minister. In international
Okay.
comparisons, in France, it's called that too, a president of government. But the fact is that you have another executive, right? Aside from, Fujimori had to face that too in 92. He had a president, I don't remember his name, the Herrera or something like that. And he resigned over the self coup. The
Well,
you don't want to call prime minister, but the president of the government resigns at the time of the self coup. Now this, I think, you don't have that in Brazil, right?
No, it's like.
And Argentina also not, and Mexico, I know you don't. So this Peru is an innovation in Peru. Do you know when it happened? Was it already in the Constitution of 1979 that they added? Because, I mean, this is, it's not a law school class, so I think that people don't always really know what this means. The president in a parliamentary system is usually a ceremonial and only in terms of a couple of prerogatives an actual function. A president in a presidential regime is the head of the executive. So the normal presidential regime, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, the government, the ministers are under the president, right? In other words, Minister of Interior, Minister of War, environment, all kinds of issues. Those are all parts of the government, but the president is the one who sits in the front when the government discusses policy. Peru, whenever it happened, and I don't want to put you on the spot with constitutional
I don't
question,
know when that happened.
whenever it happened, innovated and added a president of government, says not prime minister.
President of Congress.
No, it's the president of Congress.
There's a first minister that's under the president, and there's the president of Congress. There's no first.
Okay, so I'm getting this wrong. You were right and I was wrong. Because I thought this is the French side, you know, in France today, there is a president and there's a prime minister. The president is the boss, can remove the prime minister, but in terms of the day-to-day operations, the prime minister is head of the government. What I thought was that office in Peru is not, I'm getting it wrong. I'm thinking of, well, this is now, that would be today, who's the guy, what's the guy's, the Republican speak?
Or the new speaker.
The new speaker. That's like the speaker of the house, it's that office. That's like the speaker of the house. So it's my mistake.
Like Johnson.
You were right, I was wrong. It's still an important function. I bet you had that every.
We have the secretary of governance.
Yeah, well. You see, this is the problem with the presidential regimes, many problems. But one problem is that he's also the replacement of the king. So in that sense, he has a ritual, symbolic, ceremonial function also. So to run the day-to-day government, you very often have somebody else.
Yeah.
France is the prime minister. I don't know how it works in Peru. Yeah, go on. I'm interrupting and screwing you up.
So, to sustain the democratic backsliding that I wanted to get into,
Oh, no, you can go on, yeah.
yeah,
You don't have to, you have to cut it short.
so one of the things that are limited are free press. So you can see a military or a policeman aiming at one of the press members. Actually, one of the things that started happening in the protests were that people are identified as press members. The police would come and they would ask, which media are you representing? So if it was the wrong media, they would get beat up or shot. And the right media would not. So because it depends on what they portray. What started happening also was during the first part of the election process, the right-wing media was very openly right-wing. But then something very specific happened was that one person got killed on national TV. So they were filming just a group of protesters that were kind of on a side, just not doing anything. And you can see the exact moment when one of them is hit by a bullet in the head and he goes down. So this was a right-wing media. So what the camera did was follow the body, and then the transmission got cut off. After that, a few journalists started taking a more critical view of the government, and they started getting laid off. So there's no actual government-led eradication of free thought or free speech, but it is being led by the most powerful groups in the country. So again, you have these high-class, economically speaking, people that are actually controlling what the media can or cannot portray, what information the public has, giving false information, which is, I think, a different way of talking about a democratic backsliding. There's also pictures of random, the protest in itself became criminalized, so people got arrested just for, walking near a protest. A lot of people got killed, for 18 people that were shot. So there was a member of the Red Cross that got shot in the head for helping someone who was already on the ground. So that started getting a lot of attention from the press, from international press members, and that started applying pressure to the government to kind of pull back, but they didn't actually do it. So this picture is well, you can see it's very small, but it's a militarization of Puno, which is an area that is completely rural. There are no weapons there, but they sent the military, not even the police. And it was very shocking to see, hundreds of military men walking into a plane with just animals and just, subjecting people that had absolutely no way of resisting them. Anyway, this is a fun one. This is just Elmo. He became very present during the protest. People dressed up as Elmo to represent chaos. So now to some of the conclusions about what the democratic backsliding means. One of the things that are in some of the readings that we have is the way the state of emergency is used by a government. So state of emergency is used in extreme conditions that can be climatic conditions, earthquakes, something that allows the government to silence Congress and to take over the power. So that's what happened when the protests began. They started a state of emergency, which allowed them to militarize different areas, to pull back on rights of speech, rights of mobilization. They even went into some parties' official houses, and they pulled out a lot of documentations, they stole a lot of information, they arrested a lot of people. Again, the international pressures had them released. So people were not actually charged with crimes because there were no proofs, but they did try. So there's the same, actually, I don't know, maybe this is just my conspiracy theory, but when the protests began, Montesinos, which was Fujimori's right hand, the one that was in charge of all the tortures and missing people, he actually said to the media, I can help resolve this issue if they just give me the power. And then all the strategies they use are actually the same ones from the military dictatorship. So just a thought. So again, the state of emergency is used as an excuse for military intervention and the elimination of diversity, because again, the protesters were not white, Occidental, they're indigenous people, so there's a very strong racial ethnic factor there. There's a non-existent justice system for the government's actions. So if they send the military, if they pull back rights, the state of emergency got a continuation at least 2 or 3 times without any kind of foundation for that. And there's a refusal to listen to impartial or international actors. There's another video that that went viral where Boluarte, our current president, was actually in this international press conference, and one of the journalists asked about the repression, the tortures, and the killings, and she replied the exact same thing she says on national media, which is, you are being paid by NGOs, you're being paid by left-wing activists, so I'm not going to listen to you, which was a very interesting thing because usually politicians use different strategies for international actors and for national actors. So one of the things that Fujimori, the daughter, did was when she was campaigning and she was interviewed by the US, there's actually also videos of her being in congresses here, or conferences, excuse me. She's asked by people what her stance is on different subjects, and she gives completely different answers than she does on national TV. So since Peruvian is very conservative, she's always answering like, I will be in line with the church, I will be in line with moral values. And when she answers, let's say about LGBTQ issues, she says, I'm against this is not natural, this is not of God. But when she's in the US, she goes, I will support LGBTQ laws and indigenous or whatever. So this person is actually just outright using the exact same strategy. This being mentioned by international factors, the lack of culture of internal dialogue, but it's also recognized by the Defensoría del Pueblo, which is a ministry that defends the population inside the government, that there is no culture of dialogue. There is no, which is absolutely central to any kind of democracy. So how can a democracy be consolidated in a cultural space where you are not allowed to listen to or speak to someone that thinks differently? That is not allowed. So, and there's also been an outright interference with the judicial system. So there's actually 3 parts of government. It's not just legislative and executive, but also the justice system. So what the government right now is trying to do is to get members of the High Tribunal of Justice changed to people that are aligned with their interests. There's been a massive dismissal of prosecutors, people that were investigating crimes of corruption and other kinds of crimes related to government officials. They've been either dismissed or fired. And there's obviously the human rights violations that are perpetrated by the police themselves, and the police is being tasked to investigate them, which is absolutely ridiculous. And here's just another picture of the police. They're actually removing little signs that were protesting Repsol, which is an oil company that has massive amounts of spillage. So these were actually against Repsol, nothing related to the government, and the police were tasked with removing them. So there's a very strong affiliation with the economic, companies and the government, hence the police. So from when I started, I was working mainly with these 2 authors. And if we go back to precisely institutional order, it's definitely not being sustained. There's no free speech, there's no incorporation of different actors to make the dialogue work. And the Lisa's criteria for democracy are not sustained either. So what Peru is being called right now, it's a hybrid regime. And the reason why it's hybrid is that it is partly democratic in the sense that it's been elected by people, but also that some of the non-democratic actions are not being targeted to everyone, but specific groups. So there's specific groups that don't have freedom of speech, specific people that are being arrested without cause, but that doesn't apply to everyone. So, and this is the last part. The remaining questions that I sort of was asking myself throughout this work was, why is this still a hybrid regime? Why do we not call it just authoritarianism? You know, why still semi-democratic? So there are a few things that you can trace back to the beginning of the presentation, like the fact that legitimacy can stem from violence. We come from a very long line of successors where the coup d'etats were not necessarily used, let's say, for evil, but sometimes to remove people that were working against the interests of people. So the history of the use of violence is pervasive throughout all of Peru's history. One anecdote I can add here is when I was interviewing people that worked in Ayacucho, one of the main sites of terrorism, these people were talking about how they come from the Chancas, which is a pre-Incan culture that's made out of warriors. So there's like an identity factor that's related to the use of violence to gain power or control, even from the same community we're in. There's also a very high efficacy for the ruling sector that is sustained by inequality. So if indigenous peoples are removed from power and they are not allowed a voice in the constitution, which is one of the things that they are asking for right now, it's a new constitution, then efficacy itself, it's sustained. Because every time an indigenous person comes into office, our currency, the sol, goes down. And just the fact that it's left-leaning makes the currency go down. So that is in itself a reason a lot of people use for why we shouldn't vote for a left-leaning government. So the fact that the ruling sector, goes with capitalism, because we are not an industrialized country, it's mainly dependent on mining and agricultural factors, it requires the indigenous community to work for them. So it's sort of sustaining that Marxist scheme. And another reason for the fact that it's still semi-democratic is the need for economic stability. So one of the main, let's say, groups that were protesting actually don't come from Lima, but come from different provinces. And they are traveling to Lima because it's the only way to get their voices heard. Because in the other provinces, they just get killed and nobody knows what's happening. So they come to Lima, but coming to Lima means you need resources of money. You need to pay, for food, clothes, transportation. So one of the ways that they are suffocating the protest is just letting it, go on, because they know that these people are going to run out of money. So that eventually is, what you either support the protesters, but we lose money, we lose jobs, we lose a lot of things that we need. So, okay, let's support the government. Another factor is the semi-loyal actors. Because of the type of speech being used, you can be a semi-loyal actor to democracy, or even a disloyal actor. But if you appropriate the word democracy and use it in a specific context, or create the narratives that the media is creating, it's a lot harder to contest, to say you're not being democratic, because they just say, no, I am. I'm being democratic. You're the one who's being, you're the communist. You're the one who doesn't want the rule of law to maintain. So, yeah, they're reading analytics part of the media. And there is the fact of the inclusion of an authoritarian opposition embedded in the system, because the majority of the population is still voting for Fujimorismo, still voting for the remains of the dictatorship. So how do you produce a democratic system? Like, do you exclude these people? How can you legally exclude them? So that's been a discussion that's been had over the years, because after the terrorist movement, a new party emerged, which was the Movadef, which actually had a lot of ex-terrorists, but that were trying to create a party that was democratically, sustained, but had a socialist agenda. And there was a very strong campaign in the media against that, against the inclusion of this group, even though it was participating in a democratic, setting, and it was following the democratic rules. So the discussion is, should we let Fujimorismo, be in the running? On the one hand, it is representing a majority of the population, so it shouldn't be excluded. But on the other, if you have an openly disloyal or at least a very, questionable member, how can you maintain that? So that leads me to a final question. How can you be democratic without aiding semi-loyal forces in this kind of context? In a temporary alliance to undemocratic means maintain democracy? That's the question I can't answer right now, but that's the question I want to end it with. This is just a sign that they became very popular. It says the government steals, the police steals, the press lies. And this is a very succinct version of what the protesters are living right now.
Thanks a lot. Pretty wonderful, A+ presentation and so on. It does lead to some questions. And I think the most important one will be for us in the next couple of weeks is it backsliding when a system
It was never consolidated in the first place.
down in the first place and could not be represented as democratic? I mean, think about, presidential governments, supposedly their virtue is that for 4 years you have stability, right? And sometimes 8, 2 terms. When you have that many presidents in the preceding period, it shows a high level of instability. Certainly no one would call this, and I don't think anybody ever has called Peru a consolidated democracy. That certainly is not used because after the fall of Fujimori, or indeed before, one could not speak of consolidation. But still, it was supposed to be a democracy. Backsliding implies that you're sliding back from something that is already, and what seems to be the case here is that an order which is extremely unstable and not consolidated is breaking down and has broken down. I think one can say it has broken down. Now, it doesn't matter where we assign the blame for the President-Congress conflict. And let me just say in parentheses that the very same people will blame the president in the case of the Fujimori self-coup, who will blame Congress here, and vice versa. As I said, it's kind of funny because it looks like technically Castillo, technically in the legal sense, Castillo is carrying on a local golpe.
No, he's in jail for that.
I know, which I don't advocate. I don't support jailing a political opponent. I don't even want to jail fucking
If we go
Trump.
back to that
That's
list,
right.
most of these
You know,
people are in jail.
But the fact is that dissolving Congress at a moment when it was legally not really, it's a problem. And Fujimori did it too, except Fujimori asked for the military to come and close it down, whereas Castillo tried to get how did it actually hope to accomplish it?
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
We have different theories.
How did he think
One of the theories is that he actually is not well suited for the position in general, so he relies on asesores,
Like counselors.
counselors,
What?
Like
counselors,
Yeah.
Advisors, yeah, but.
advisors.
They told us, yeah, but still, Fujimori at least, a more down-to-earth guy that he was, made sure the military was going to support this.
He, I think, was trusting the support from the people.
The people, well, yeah, but think about the mediations required
No,
for
it was
that.
still a very, that's why it's
And
called a
the
political
mediations for
suicide.
that, if you're a utopian revolutionary, you may think that that's how it happens. But I mean, the Congress is not gonna walk away, right? The way you close down Congress from Lenin on, right? Who closed down the Constituent Assembly in January of 1918. The way to do it is to send in the troops. Lenin said in the Red Guard, and they closed it down, right? That's how it's done. You can't close Congress unless they close themselves. This legal dissolution meant that the legal advisors of Congress say we're dissolved now, and so we're going to have an election, prepare for the election. But it was not following that route. So he was following an extra legal, even if legitimate, right? That you use, dissolution. How was this gonna happen? So that's one side of it. On the other side, the fact that they keep on impeaching him and they keep on doing that means they're bringing the system down, right? I mean, on some level. So you could say on both sides, the two branches of, and the courts, I won't even mention, because, basically, already in the Fujimori self-coup, the courts were a problem. It dissolves the courts, basically, dissolves the Constitutional Tribunal, reconstitutes it, because if you're trying to accomplish something like this, think about the United States, you would need to deal with the courts. You can't just say you're gone. They won't go. So the courts have to reinforce the order. In this particular case, that was hopeless. So you have actually a breakdown. And if you have a breakdown, I'm not trying to excuse anything that happens afterwards and the violence, all the rest, but backsliding becomes a strange concept. I'm not criticizing you because you did
No,
a
I understand.
very interesting thing with it, but it becomes a difficult concept to use in that case. All right, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the questions that I think I asked you when we talked a couple
Oh,
weeks
so maybe
before.
I did not.
No, the question was how do we name this? I maintained backsliding because there was an attempt of instauration of democracy that worked for maybe 15 years.
Yeah, no, I understand. In terms of this long-term sense, that's certainly is true. But we have a difficulty actually even identifying the process. It's not exactly a coup. It's not exactly a self-coup. The self-coup was attempted and failed. After a self-coup attempt which fails, are the others who carry out countermeasures carrying out a coup. I think the left will say today, yes. The left will say there was a right-wing coup, the military was involved, the vice president was implicated, but technically that's still a coup in terms of the old Latin American meaning of a coup. Well, not the standard scenario, obviously, but it is a way of bringing down the democratic order. Now, the next difficult question, Alexander, and I did a fantastic presentation, so I don't mean to ask questions indicating at all any reservation, is in a state of emergency backsliding. Now, we know that in almost all constitutional republics, there is some possibility for emergency rule, right? I mean, that must be there. And this has been explained, ever since the French Revolution by lots of people, that, under some conditions in France, it's a state of siege, but it has different names. The greatest author on this is Clinton Rossiter, called constitutional dictatorship. That's an indicative term because, in a way, we're going to have Emmanuel Guerrieri actually address this matter here in the presentation, because he's going to talk about emergency in the United States, which never gets to this level. Well, maybe the Civil War gets to this level. Fortunately, you're not yet having it in Peru. Latin America, there have been civil wars in some setting. Peru too had civil wars, 19th century and so on.
And with Muslims, what about FDR?
Very excellent question. Well, in fact, FDR, through the court packing scheme, indicated that he was getting into your ballpark, the Latin American ballpark. But when Congress refused, he said, all right, guys, forget about it. I love this expression, forget about it in New York. This is the way you say it in New York. It's so funny. But FDR said, okay, that was yesterday, guys. You don't have to do it now. So in fact, he backed down. He backed down in a setting which in some ways began to resemble this, only formally, because I don't think they were massive on the street on both sides. Wasn't like that. But there was a danger. And Abraham Lincoln did have to deal with it, so it happens once. FDR, you're right, comes close. But he backs down. I mean, Castillo had a chance to back down a couple of times. Right? You probably, I can see it on your face, you wish that he had. you wish that he knew what he was doing and he had. I see, I'm reading your I'm not giving you an interpretation, but I'm a face reader. And I could see that that was, yes, I mean, you can't, Fujimori overcame congressional resistance by a self-coup. But he had the military to carry it out. Castillo was relying on his advisors. That's what you just said.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
that's
that's one
pathetic.
theory. That's
What?
one theory because we don't know what could have gone through his
You
head
don't know what's in his head.
to do something so stupid.
Because the masses will get on the street
Yes,
and,
which actually happened, but
will
in
have,
very small,
happen afterwards.
but it happened in very small.
I guess deep down he's a leftist revolutionary. Deep down, maybe he doesn't even know it,
He didn't.
but in terms of his deepest impulses, he's kind of revolutionary.